creation science, as some of you are familiar, is an effort to take a biblical literalist view of Genesis and claim there's scientific warrant for it, that there's data and theory that support, in the most common form, a young Earth, that support a sudden appearance of all living things at approximately one time, and obviously is an anti-evolution position. When proposals were made at a local level in a school district in Dover, Pennsylvania, to promote something called intelligent design, the court struck down intelligent design for the same reason. It was decided this was a religious view. There was no secular reason to teach it because it wasn't valid science. And therefore, it was not constitutional to teach intelligent design. So, what is the creationism du jour? What is the current approach of creationists? Well, I won't go into all the details of the legal argument. One of the legal underpinnings of the creationism du jour is to look at the decision that struck down the teaching of creation science and find some wording in there that they believe supports their cause. The creationism du jour is something called evidence against evolution. In other words, you teach evolution and you teach the evidence against evolution, and this balances it out. We don't know whether this is going to be constitutional. This is the creationism du jour. This has not been tested in the courts, and we don't know whether courts will understand the history of this movement and see that evidence against evolution is just one more repackaging of the creationist point of view. But that's what we're going to talk about this morning. What is this evidence against evolution? Well, where the idea of teaching evidence against evolution to balance to balance evolution comes from is a pretty long-standing creationist point of view. What they call the two-model approach. Now, their view is that there's only two possibilities. There's either biblical special creationism, which is what they believe is the truth, or there is evolution. Now, this is not illogical. This is a perfectly reasonable, logical, if not A, then B. So, if you can disprove evolution, creationism wins by default. No problem. So, if you look at especially the creation science literature, but really the intelligent design literature as well. If you look at this, the anti-evolution literature, it is really anti-evolution. There's very little in the literature, understandably, that supports the idea of the sudden appearance of all living things at one time. Very little that supports the idea of a specially created Earth only 10,000 years ago, etc., etc. Pardon me. So most of the discussion that takes place in the creationist literature is evidence against evolution because of their logical, because the whole way they look at these two subjects is as dichotomous choices. Now, from a logical standpoint, it's true. The problem is the premises. The premises are completely wrong because over there on the creationism side, there are many alternatives other than biblical special creationism, including the predominant view in Christian theology, which is theistic evolution, that God creates through the process of evolution. But there are so many other religious views that deal, at least in part, with the idea of the natural world and creation. And disproving evolution, were you actually able to do so, which obviously they have not succeeded in doing, would not refute them either. There are other world religions. There are religions that are no longer being practiced. I made a joke in a talk recently about, given the Avengers series, people may start praying to Thor again. But basically, there are tribal religions. There are lots and lots of religion. Disproving evolution doesn't prove them any more than it proves biblical special creationism. So the logic fails of the two-model approach. But this is really at the heart of the creationist attack upon evolution, because they believe that refuting evolution means they win by default because of this two-model approach, dichotomous thinking. Now, I mentioned very briefly that there was a legal decision that struck down the teaching of creation science as being constitutional. As soon as that happened, creation science proponents switched to encouraging the teaching of evidence against evolution. In this article in Acts and Facts, they wrote, quote, "Teachers should be encouraged to teach the scientific evidences and arguments against evolution in their classes, not just arguments against some proposed evolutionary mechanism, but against evolution per se," by which they mean common ancestry, "even if they don't wish to recognize these as evidences and arguments for creation." So, evidence against evolution. This is the familiar two-model approach, of course. If you disprove evolution, you have proved creationism by default. And evidence against evolution, in their minds, is really evidence for creationism. Now, the court said you can't teach creationism. So their argument is, therefore, teach evidence against evolution, which is creationism by the back door. This is the creationism du jour, the teaching of evidence against evolution. Now, there's another little piece of the evidence against evolution point of view that fits into the current creationist strategy. And this is back in the 90s and early 2000s, there were a number of situations where a district regulation or a state law required the teaching of, excuse me, where there was no state law, there were no district directives, no school district directives to teach creationism or what, but individual teachers decided to freelance. In these legal cases, Pelosa, Webster, and LeVake, teachers were teaching creationism. The district told them to knock it off. The teachers sued the district for their rights to teach these subjects. It was sort of a academic freedom kind of argument. Now, in each of these cases, the courts upheld the right of the district to tell the teacher what to teach. Now, remember, there is virtually no academic freedom for pre-college teachers. And sometimes when I mention that, people are kind of dismayed. They think, oh, that's terrible. You know, teachers should really have lots and lots of academic freedom. But I think when you think about this, it's really makes a lot of sense to consider that at that pre-college level, the district really has an interest in having continuity from class to class. You don't really want fourth graders in this class learning this, fourth graders in that class learning something else, because when they get to fifth grade, they're expected to know the same stuff. It's a really different situation, K-12, than it is at the university level. At the university level, academic freedom is a much more important concept. It's much more relevant to the activity that's going on. When you look at the K-12 level, the activity that's going on is really considerably more modest, shall we say, than that. It's my hypothesis that the creationists chafed under these decisions. They really were quite concerned that these individual freelancing teachers were being stopped in their tracks, and they know that there's a fairly substantial percentage of teachers who would like to teach creationism if you give them a chance. So these thou shalt not freelance teaching the creationism cases really annoyed them considerably. In the early 2000s, we saw the very first Academic Freedom Act, which was filed in Alabama. And this act was intended to encourage the teaching of creationism without actually using the term creationism. The sponsor of the bill actually said that the teaching of alternative theories, quote, would level the playing field because it allows a teacher to bring forward the biblical creation story of humankind. It was just flat out. Evolution is one theory, creation is an alternative theory. So he didn't call what he was proposing to teach creationism. He called them alternative theories, but this is how he was reasoning. In 2004, the bill got out of committee, but it didn't get through the House before the legislature adjourned, and so the bill never became law, and the Alabama bill died. But it did become very significant in terms of inspiring the wording for a number of future bills. One of the novel approaches in the Alabama bill that had not been common in previous anti-evolution bills was that it protected teachers from being disciplined in their districts for teaching alternative theories. I think this was inspired by those lawsuits. Well, there are many attempts to follow Alabama's lead. This is only a partial list of the upwards of 40 or so bills that NCSE has tracked over the years. Only 2 of these bills have passed, which isn't too bad a ratio, but we'd be a whole lot happier if none of them passed. By the way, there are reasons why these bills don't pass, and the reason, of course, is because good citizens get up and do the things that need to be done, as they say on Prairie Home Companion. They go to the committees, they talk to the legislators, and they try to persuade them that these bills should not be passed. And 38 times out of 40, they've succeeded. We are very respectful and very grateful to the many, many citizens that NCSE works with around the country. They really, we may be able to provide information and advice, but it's local voting citizens that have to get the job done. Now, these bills vary somewhat one-to-one, but all of them reflect the idea that there is academic freedom involved in the teaching of science. In 2008, Louisiana passed the Louisiana Science Education Act, which originated as the Louisiana Academic Freedom Act, but was renamed during the somewhat extended course of its debate and passage. The original version of the bill had some very clever components. Courts had previously said that singling out evolution for special treatment was evidence for having a religious purpose, so the original bill bundled evolution with origin of life, global warming, and human cloning. We're not really interested just in evolution. No, not us. We're interested in all these controversial subjects. Now, I can pretty much assure you that human cloning is not really a topic that you find regularly in the high school curriculum. This is not, this is not a major issue. Excuse me. The bill also said that administrators could not discipline teachers for teaching the, quote, strengths and weaknesses of evolution and these other topics, which to me looks like an obvious attempt to circumvent the First Amendment. The original bill also restricted administrators from, quote, censoring or prohibiting the use of any instructional materials that presented critiques of these subjects, which certainly worked well to the advantage of the Discovery Institute, which wrote a book exactly for the purpose of presenting the weaknesses of evolution. This bill was also clever in that it was permissive rather than directive. Teachers are permitted to bring in the evidence against evolution. They don't have to bring in the evidence against evolution and so forth. This is very useful for legal reasons because it makes it a lot more difficult to bring a lawsuit. Reflecting the separation of church and state, the bill does not couch its intents in terms of religion. In fact, it even had a disclaimer stating that, quote, nothing in the bill should be construed as promoting religion. Nobody here but us secularists, right? After a protracted struggle with a lot of behind-the-scenes work from our friends on the ground in Louisiana, who deserve a great deal of thanks, the bill that finally passed was better than the original bill, but it was still very problematic. Essentially, it kicked the task upstairs, where upon request of school districts, the State Department of Education was to, quote, foster an environment within public elementary and secondary schools that promotes critical thinking skills, logical analysis, and open and objective discussion of scientific theories, including, of course, evolution, the origin of life, global warming, and human cloning. I want to see the lab myself. But. Now, again, this is a permissive bill. It doesn't say that teachers have to do it. They say you can do it, and if you do it, we will protect you. This is a dog whistle to creationists. Creationists understand this language. Now, teachers were still encouraged to teach evidence against evolution and global warming denial. So the main problem with the bill was retained, although the protective component was removed, much to the relief of administrators who lobbied against it out of fear that they would not be able to discipline teachers who might bring in creationism and therefore expose the district to a lawsuit. This was 2008, 3 years after Dover, which was a very expensive lawsuit for the Dover, Pennsylvania community. Meanwhile, our friends at the Discovery Institute had come out with a Model Academic Freedom Act in 2007, and they've been promoting it ever since. The Discovery Institute, which is the predominant intelligent design promoting organization, they've long promoted a view that there's great persecution of proponents of intelligent design and that some sort of legal protection is needed. This is a view that is at the heart of the movie Expelled.
In case you don't remember Expelled, it was an egregiously offensive movie starring actor Ben Stein. It claimed there was a Darwinist conspiracy of scientists trying to keep the ID movement suppressed. Everyone on the evolution side who was interviewed for the movie was interviewed under false pretenses, including P.Z. Meyer and me. And speaking of P.Z., who's here in this room today, morning P.Z., ask him to tell you the story of the pre-launch screening he attended. P.Z. signed up for one of these previews in Minneapolis in March of 2008. And he used his own name, his university address, didn't try to dissemble in any respect, wasn't trying to hide anything. He was allowed to bring guests to the screening in the sign-up, so he told them he would bring guests. When he showed up with his wife, his daughter's boyfriend, and another guest, they all signed in, showed their ID, and went to stand in line. Theater security came over and said the producer did not want PZ to see him, and thus he was told to leave. He was expelled from Expelled. But they let his guest remain in line to see the movie. His wife, his daughter's boyfriend, and his guest Richard Dawkins, whom no one running the show had recognized. Imagine their surprise when he stood up during the question period and gave his opinion of the movie. But PZ can tell you the details. It is a wonderful, wonderful story. In any regard, the Discovery Institute has been especially concerned about the alleged discrimination against ID proponents, primarily at the university level. And Expelled discusses a number of cases that the Discovery Institute has promoted as examples, such as Guillermo Gonzalez, who was denied tenure at the University of Iowa, allegedly because of an ID book he wrote, Richard von Sternberg, who was roundly criticized for an ID article that he had published in a small museum journal that he edited. By the way, he didn't lose a job or lost money or anything else. People just said bad things about him, and so he's a victim. They must not read the internet. And Carolyn Crocker, who was one of the other alleged expelled people who claims employment discrimination regarding jobs. She held at a variety of universities in the DC area, and so on. At the time Expelled was released in 2008, NCSE prepared a website, expelledexposed.com, that analyzed the movie, including the claims of the persecuted ID supporters. If you follow that link, you'll find biographies, shall we say, details of why the movie paints a misleading picture of what happened to these people. The truth is much less dramatic than portrayed in the movie. In general, when people didn't get tenure or didn't get rehired, it wasn't because of their ID activities, but because their work was not considered suitable or of high enough quality. In other words, for cause. But the Discovery Center is nonetheless quite convinced that there's this terrible discrimination going on, and so they drew up this Model Academic Freedom Act, similar along those lines. Teachers, including university professors, may, quote, present scientific information pertaining to the full range of scientific views regarding biological and chemical evolution. Now, this phrase, full range of views, is another dog whistle to creationists. It's similar to the alternative theories wording that creationists use, and of course includes ID. It comes from a resolution that Senator Santorum submitted for the No Child Left Behind law, which was drafted by intelligent design proponent Philip Johnson. Full range of scientific views is equivalent to alternative views, which is equivalent to creationism and ID. The Discovery Institute Model Bill is protective of teachers and professors and students, protecting them from loss of tenure or any other disciplinary actor if they subscribe to a, quote, particular position on evolution. Creationism, ID, is never mentioned. In 2008, Discovery Institute and its model bill strongly influenced a bill proposed by Florida State Senator Rhonda Storms, who introduced her version of the Academic Freedom Act during the 2008 legislative session. As proposed in the DI model legislation, teachers would have the right to teach the full range of views, in other words, code for evidence against evolution and creationism, prohibited administrators from cracking down on teachers who teach this bad science, left the door open for students to promote creationist views in their assignment. Heroic work by the Florida Citizens for Science, but also really good luck, defeated this bill. The bill did not pass pass both houses before the legislative session ended, so it did not become law. The Discovery Institute, by the way, was on site lobbying legislators and holding public events in the big auditorium, the big, not auditorium, the Coliseum where they hold the sports events and so forth. The DI draft bill is compared to the Florida Academic Freedom Act. The similarities are quite clear. You're not supposed to memorize this, but just notice the red ink there that refers to basically identical or almost identical wording. Well, the Florida bill fortunately didn't pass. There were several new academic freedom acts between 2008 and 2012, and all of them died in committee or otherwise were not passed. But in the spring of 2012, Tennessee State Senator Bo Watson pushed through a resubmitted bill from 2011 called the Tennessee Academic Freedom Act, and the second of these bills became law. Mr. Watson's Tennessee bill called for students to, quote, explore scientific questions, learn about scientific evidence, develop critical thinking skills, and respond appropriately and respectfully to differences of opinion about scientific subjects. So a pretty standard academic freedom act, stressing critical thinking of students and academic freedom. Like the original Louisiana bill and the original Alabama bill, it stated that neither the school board nor any other administrative unit could prohibit a teacher, quote, from helping students understand, analyze, critique, and review the strengths and weaknesses of existing scientific theory. When you see the phrase critically analyze, critique, and review, that also is code. Critically analyze means criticize. It does not actually mean critical thinking in the sense that most of us define that term. And the scientific theories that they had in mind are, no surprise, evolution, origin of life, global warming, and human cloning. The similarities between the Tennessee and the Louisiana bill are quite clear. Both of them bundle origin of life, global warming, and cloning, and evolution. Both are couched in terms of critical thinking. Both encourage teachers to critique evolution and other subjects, and both have an obligatory statement that they are not intended to promote religion, trying to deduct the First Amendment. The Tennessee bill, in addition, is protective, which was brought over from descendants of the Alabama bill. I suspect these provisions are going to crop up elsewhere as the bill is vaguely enough worded to preclude a facial challenge. Now, as do all evolutionists, we think in terms of descent with modification. One of my colleagues a few years ago came up with a phylogeny of academic freedom acts. Now, admittedly, this phylogeny goes only to 2009, which is sort of like stopping with the Oligocene when discussing mammal evolution, but we haven't had a lot of time to update it. And besides, like mammals in the Oligocene, the basic patterns have been established and there's not a lot that's new. Basically, there's two major strands of academic freedom laws, the first beginning with the Alabama bill. The original Alabama bill protected the rights of students and teachers to express their views, protected them from being disciplined by administrators, and was worded in terms of teachers being able to teach alternative theories. The Alabama bill was critiqued by the Discovery Institute, who, being more legally savvy, got later versions to drop references to alternative theories, which it then replaced with the full range of scientific views language from the No Child Left Behind Act. Of course, in the original full range of scientific views, in the minds of creationists, this includes creation science and ID, so again, code to creationists. The Discovery Institute's own model bill referred to wording from the decision striking down creation science, Edwards versus Aguilard, so it called for scientific critiques of prevailing scientific theories could be taught. And it also strengthened the Santorum language. This tree represents another strain of academic freedom acts originating from a 2006 policy passed in Ouachita Parish, Louisiana, and promoted by the Louisiana Family Forum. It bundled evolution with other religious right concerns, like global warming, origin of life, and cloning. It used the strengths and weaknesses language that we've seen in Texas and elsewhere. The Louisiana Academic Freedom Act, passed a couple of years later, was introduced by the father of the Ouachita Parish bill when he was elected to the State House of Representatives. It was couched in terms of encouraging critical thinking of students, critical analysis of scientific theories, and so forth, but it's also protective of teachers. It added the provision that administrators can't censor materials and included a disclaimer that the bill was not intended to promote religion. Now, the two strains, as in horizontal gene transfer, have influenced one another. Although the Louisiana bill originally was inspired by the Ouachita Parish regulation, its descendants have been influenced by the Discovery Institute model bill, and the Discovery Institute, of course, modified the Alabama bill. Academic freedom for teachers runs through both sides, but like jumping genes, provisions like whether teachers are protected for teaching evidence against evolution or whether evolution is bundled with other subjects can hop back and forth. Generally speaking, this lineage to the left uses language like full range of scientific views and focuses on a teacher's freedom of expression and gives students permission to attack evolution. On the right, you get language like strengths and weaknesses, critical analysis, and so on. Often include global warming, stem cells, origin of life, etc. A bill that did not pass in Kentucky in 2011 might be a model for future academic freedom type bills. HB 169 didn't even mention evolution, which is very interesting, although it got in most of the buzzwords familiar from academic freedom acts. Like the Louisiana statute, it directed administrators to foster an environment for critical thinking. Also, like Louisiana, it allowed teachers to bring in outside materials to supplement the curriculum approved by the district, and again called for the critique and review of scientific theories. Not mentioning evolution at all is the ultimate dog whistle to creationists, ironically enough. Let's recap the academic freedom bills. Creationism du jour. From a legal standpoint, they tend to be vaguely written. They are not specific about creationism or religion, but there's plenty of hints, if you know the history, about what the goals are. They express popular themes: academic freedom, critical thinking. These are themes that are very hard to oppose. We're all in favor of critical thinking, right? It's just that in their hands, it doesn't turn out quite the way we thought. And finally, they encourage creationist teachers by promising them protection if they go off the rails. It's kind of a get-out-of-jail-free card for creationist teachers. Minimally, teachers will be encouraged to teach a lot of bad creationist science, and that's not very good for American scientific literacy. So that's why the article that appeared about this proposed law in Indiana showed up in the news a couple weeks ago. We said, not again. But that's what we do. It's probably safe to say that NCSE is going to have plenty to do in the future coping with the creationism du jour. I think after January, it's going to be a busy time. The NCSE materials can be found at ncse.com. My staff includes Glenn Branch, the Deputy Director, Robert Lunn is Communications Director, Peter Hess is Religious Community Outreach, and the Flare-Ups Wranglers, Josh Rosenow and Steve Newton. I handle a lot of the calls that come in, what do? We elected the wrong school board. Education Director Eric Mickel also pitches in on flare-ups, as do we all. And we have two new climate change specialists to introduce to you, Mark McCaffrey and the brand new Minda Berbecco, who's only been there a couple months. NCSE.com has a lot more information on this. There's a wonderful electronic newsletter you can sign up for. It comes up every Friday. Glenn Branch does it, and it's brilliant. You can sign up for it at that button there. If you want to check out our climate change materials, please do. I wasn't talking about that today, but there's a lot of parallels between teacher pushback against climate change as well as evolution. And if you go to the news page, you'll be taken to this page where you can learn all what is new and depressing about the creation and evolution movement. If you check this pull-down menu here, you get international news, and we put anything we find about your nation as well. And we are a membership organization, so obviously we appreciate your support. We have a YouTube site and a Facebook site. That's Steve Gould holding the world's best evolutionary bumper sticker. Honk if you understand punctuated equilibria. And I am also on Facebook. If you do want to friend me on Facebook, please do so at eugenie.scott. There's a number of other Eugenie Scott pages there, but this is the one I actually update. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of your program, even if I don't know the date. Good morning.
Hi. For the academic freedom bills that have been coming up recently, do you think if someone were to get a job as a teacher and instead of promoting creationism were to go in and say something like completely the opposite of what these bills are for, like, guess what, kids, there is no God, your parents have been lying to you, climate change is real, the whole thing. Now, I wouldn't normally support that, but do you think as a challenge to the bill it would work? Because I'm pretty sure most of the people promoting these bills would flip out if that happened.
Well, I think it would be exceedingly unwise for any teacher to say your parents are lying to you. That's just not a good approach.
No,
all right?
but
that's not.
no.
But what a teacher can say is, when it comes to climate change, when it comes to evolution, forget cloning, that's nonsense. When it comes to climate change and evolution, the scientific community concurs that this is good science. It's my job as a high school teacher to teach you the consensus view of science, so we're going to talk about what the scientists say. And in a sense, what a teacher needs to do is kick it upstairs to the science community. Now, I'm sorry, you had a follow-up?
I was more just if they'd actually like challenged the religion or said,
Oh, that's different. You're saying tell the kids your parents are lying, and that's a bad idea. Is your question, can a teacher come in and say, look, religion's bunk, you shouldn't believe in God?
Yeah, something like that. Like
no, you can.
Yeah,
because the Constitution says.
No, I understand that. I meant just trying to challenge the academic freedom bill in that way, like saying something the opposite of what they wanted to, and then tried to use the bill as protection.
Well, the bill says that the bills are intended to encourage teachers to bring in anti-evolution material, climate change denier material. They're crafted to try to promote the Discovery Institute's view of that you'll find expressed in their book Explore Evolution, the book that I showed briefly on that they wrote for these kinds of bills. And if you read that book, it says nothing about creationism, says nothing about intelligent design. It's all about the weaknesses of evolution. It's all about how the concept of homology is circular, and it's all about how biochemical information disproves evolution. Yeah, this is what the book's about. And it's basically really, really bad science, but it never mentions religion. Now, of course, that's why I say these bills are legally very tricky, because creationists have gotten a lot better at avoiding the First Amendment. And it's really the First Amendment that protects us against these bills. There's nothing in the Constitution about teaching bad science. That's legal, okay? Yeah. But if you can show that the intent and or effect of these bills is to promote the teaching of creationism, then we have a chance of stopping them in the United States. But just for a teacher to, it certainly is reasonable for a teacher to say, here's what Explore Evolution says about homology, here's what it says about the fossil record, and here's why it's wrong. That's perfectly possible to do. But remember, the high school and middle school curriculum are chocked to the gills with stuff teachers have to teach by the end of the semester so that the kids can pass the state exam. And they just don't have time to do that, because that's a very time-consuming process. If you're going to teach kids about why the creationist arguments about biochemistry or of the fossil record are wrong, there's a lot of background information that a high school student isn't going to understand about radioisotopic dating, for example, and why the fossil record is as it is. So a teacher, that could be a very good critical thinking exercise, but not if it means teachers have to give up teaching another week of subject matter that they know is going to be on the exam.
We'll take one more question and we have to move on.
Good morning.
Hi, my name's Anya. So my question has to do with one of the ways that I'm finding, at least here in Canada, that some teachers are trying to avoid, to sort of backhanded creationism is just to avoid the teaching or the discussion of evolution at all, where they just kind of don't bring it up, or they bring it up in some really watered down, wishy-washy way, like in my sister's school, where she had a science teacher tell her, oh, we came from humans that were just a little bit hairier than the ones we have now. Which boggles the mind.
Haven't met my husband.
So my question has to do with how do you combat that kind of attempt to sort of funnel in the agenda? Because I find what you end up with
I know. Yes, we have the same problem. Teaching is a helping profession. They don't go into education because they want to fight with parents. They go into education because they want to teach kids, they want to make a difference. Learning is important. Teachers are, it's a noble profession, okay? But I totally understand why a teacher who anticipates getting beat up by some parent, not literally, would want to just avoid a controversial issue, especially if it's not a very important one. Now, of course, if you really understand biology, evolution is a pretty important issue. It's a whole lot more important than photosynthesis, for crying out loud. But they spend a lot more time on photosynthesis than they do on evolution, because evolution is controversial. Combat is the wrong verb. You don't want to combat that. What you want to do is support that teacher. What you want to do is increase that teacher's confidence that if a parent or an administrator starts leaning on the teacher, you'll back them. What I encourage people to do in the U.S., and you could certainly do here, is there's usually a back-to-school night or some sort of event where parents are invited to come in and meet the teachers and so forth. At that back-to-school night, and sit down with the science teacher and say, yeah, gee, Mrs. Brown, I'm really glad that Bobby's in your class, and I'm really glad that evolution's in the curriculum. It is in the United States, whether it's skipped or not. It is here, whether it's skipped or not. It's really important to me that evolution be taught. And by the way, if anybody gives you any trouble about teaching evolution, just let me know. I mean, I'm behind you. I got your back.
Okay.
When teachers feel supported, they're much more likely to teach evolution.
All right, thanks again to Eugenie Scott.